In 1970, Dr. Zbigniew Brzezinski, a highly respected political scientist, national security expert, and advisor to many Western world leaders, advised them that they had to do everything within their power to prevent the Africans that have been spread throughout the diaspora by the slave trade from uniting with native Africans politically, culturally, and economically. Because when Africans are kept divided globally, we lose our numerical advantage and we're stripped of all hopes of defeating global white supremacy. The white society's exploitation of Africans has provided it with an era in which it has flourished most throughout history. To allow this era to end would be directly against the interests of the white society, especially given that the white society's dependence upon Africa's natural resources is an indefinite one. To meet this objective of keeping us divided, they started deploying a divide and conquer psychological warfare campaigns against Africans globally. To divide and displace Africans against our motherland of Africa, white propaganda designers started deploying anti-African media propaganda campaigns denigrating the image of Africa. Through repetitive media subliminal propaganda programming, it causes the many displaced Africans to feel negatively about Mother Africa. These propaganda campaigns subjects African Americans, Africans throughout the diaspora, to seeing only the images of war-torn, famine-ridden, rapidly illiterate, and disease-stricken Africa. By showing only the poorest parts of Africa, this turned Africa into a source of shame and humiliation for the Africans spread outside of Africa. It's easy to separate people from their ancestral land once they've been made ashamed of it. This anti-African propaganda campaign is so strong that only those possessing the strongest mental fortitude can resist its negative implied programming against Africa. Those negative images of Africa also subliminally conveys the message that we Africans who were brought out by slavery actually benefited by slavery. It makes many perceive the enslavement of our ancestors as being more of a rescue mission that ultimately took us away from the terrible, scary, backwards land of Africa. This propaganda campaign literally causes many Africans who are spread throughout the world by slavery to actually feel grateful that slavery happened. These significantly eases our collective aggressions away from the white society where we've been deployed to. It was this anti-African propaganda campaign that significantly eroded African Americans' allegiance toward Africa. It, in fact, totally changed the African American culture. During the 1960s, African Americans' allegiance towards Africa was very strong. This was made evident by the fact that many African Americans had started wearing afros and cornrows and dashikis, and many were giving themselves African nicknames or African sounding nicknames. This close anti-African propaganda has eroded that allegiance to such an extent that now many African Americans perceive it as an insult to be called an African. And many will accept any claim that allows them to be anything other than an African. In fact, many prefer to be called a nigger than an African. This is the reality. This anti-African propaganda campaign broke down the African American sense of Black racial heritage and allegiance towards Africa, thus increasing our patriotism to America because we're seeing them as rescuers. Africans throughout the diaspora are also being miseducated against Africa. The history of the African slave trade taught to Africans throughout the diaspora has been whitewashed by claiming that most African slaves were sold away and fairly purchased by the white enslavers. This has been deliberately done to make the white invaders appear more humane and to shift the blame of the African slave trade more greatly upon Africans, adding to the divide. Now, yes, some Africans did engage in the slave trade, but their participation has been exaggerated to reduce the white society's culpability in the slave trade. The majority of the Africans that participated did so under duress. Seeing that they couldn't overcome the weaponry advantages held by the Caucasians through their guns and cannons, those participants therefore agreed to assist the Caucasian capturing other slaves in exchange for their tribes being left alone. The whitewashed history books that claim that most slaves were sold off deliberately hides the brutal massacre of countless African warriors that died in battles trying to rescue their loved ones from those slave ships. As the African warriors charged the beach, the ship's crew shot cannon and rifle bullets into their bodies, leaving thousands of blood-soaked black bodies laying on the white sands of Africa. The number of Africans that died in battles fought against the white enslaver, the white invaders, far exceeded many times over the number of Africans that actually assisted in the slave trade. The hiding of these fierce battles and massacre is deliberately done to perpetuate the lie that benefits the white society that most Africans were sold away. To further convey the falsehood that most Africans were sold away by other Africans, several white artists were hired to create pictures of Africans selling their fellow Africans to the white invaders. Reproductions of those drawings and paintings can still be found within American school textbooks. Therefore, every time that an African American student reads about the slave trade, those pictures are there showing black selling black. This is to subliminally program their minds to perceive that the wrongs that was done to our ancestors was done mostly by fellow Africans. But critically think and ask yourself this question. If Africans originally owned all the gold, diamonds, minerals, and natural resources, and the West had nothing that Africa needed, and Western money had no value whatsoever in Africa, how then is it possible that the majority of the millions of enslaved Africans were fairly purchased? Think. And given all that we now know of Caucasians, why wouldn't the greedy white enslavers maximize their profit by using their weaponry advantages of guns and cannons to kidnap most of the slaves, or to coerce many other Africans but to aid them in capturing slaves? To believe that the greedy and corrupt white invaders went into Africa with weaponry advantage of guns and cannons, but rather than maximize their profit, they instead found a way to fairly purchase most of those slaves? It's absolutely laughable. It's actually asinine, because such a claim totally contradicts over 500 years of demonstrated behavior by white people in regard to black people when it comes to making profit. When critically thinking, using common sense, and looking at facts, it becomes clear that most African slaves were not sold away by Africans. However, yet through miseducation, millions of Africans throughout the diaspora have been miseducated to believe that version of the story. Our minds are constantly being manipulated to think in ways that serve the white society, and most of us are totally clueless of it. Here's how they turn many Native Africans against African Americans. The media images shown to Native Africans of we African Americans are those that depicts us in an unflattering, buffoonery, and culturally disconnected manner. Furthermore, African Americans are made to appear as criminals and thugs and lazy, and as being a part of a treacherous, frightening, and insane fringe. These images reinforces negative stereotypes about African Americans, and it produces fear of us. It's the reason why many Native Africans come to this country looking down on African Americans. You know? And there's even this that we're lazy. They buy into the narrative and they start seeing us, perceiving us through the white eyes. Many Africans come to this country thinking they have more in common with white people than would be African Americans, because the propaganda campaign. They come here looking at those who could very well be their blood relatives. These are facts. This divide and conquer works both ways. It works, and we don't have a global media. The white man does. The white man used his advantages through his control over information to depict information warfare that keeps us thinking and acting and behaving in ways that serve the system of white supremacy. Come on, we see many of the behavior among our people, the thoughts of our people, the perception of our people, that is on line with the objective and benefiting to the white society. Whenever the oppressed thinks in ways that benefits their oppressors, is always by design of the oppressors. Throughout history, the perceptions held by the oppressors never truly their own. They're always false perceptions beneficial to the oppressors that have been shrewdly embedded into the minds of the oppressed by the oppressors without them even realizing it. Our core problem is that Black people don't realize how our minds are constantly and systematically being manipulated to think in ways that serve and protect the system of white supremacy. If you're not a critical thinker, you're mentally enslaved. There's no exception. If you're not a critical thinker who questions the validity of all information that you get from the white society, you are mentally enslaved by the white society. This is 100% fact. If you allow them, now think, the white society has never earned the blind trust of Black people. They merely socially engineer our mind to believe that they have. The white society has never earned the credibility to control the narratives that Black people receive, because they've been telling lies about us for 500 years. They merely socially engineer our minds to believe that they earn the credibility. We have to understand how white society exploits the monopoly over information that we receive to brainwash our minds to think in ways that benefit themselves. Those Black people who don't critically think never notice their mental change. One love and peace.